Hello, hello, and welcome back to Sage and Stone Homestead. My name is Heather, and today I'm doing something that I have actually never done before, and I've actually never seen it done. But the methods for pickling these cucamelons should be very similar to the methods that I have used in the past for fermenting cucumbers and peppers and beans and things like that. So I think that the result is going to be pretty favorable. So I picked a whole bunch of cucamelons yesterday, and for reference, I have 3 plants. It is towards the end of the season, and so they are very large and producing a ton. One of the easiest ways that I have found to preserve a smaller harvest, aside from dehydrating, is fermenting. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be fermenting these cucamelons into cute little cucamelon pickles. I'd like to make a dill pickle, and I have some fresh dill in the garden. We'll make sure to go get some of that, but I'm also going to be using some pickling spice that I bought at the store. Now, some of the little herbs and seeds and things, I'm nervous about them floating in my brine. And if you know much about fermenting, you know that anything that's floating above the brine has the potential to mold in any ferment. And I would really like to decrease the chances that this ferment is going to mold, because I don't know if I'm going to be able to harvest this many cucamelons until next year. So I don't want to mess this up. So a really cool trick that I saw was to actually cut open a tea bag and use the tea bag itself as basically a satchel for the herbs. And I'm actually going to leave the tea leaves inside of the tea bag. The tannins that are in the tea should help keep our cucamelons nice and crisp without leaving a black tea flavor in the ferment. I haven't tried this before, but many people have, and it seemed like a really great way to use the tea bag with also not wasting the tea. So I'm tying off one end here. 2 teaspoons is probably more than plenty. How cool is this? This is perfect. Now we've got to go pick our fresh dill. If you didn't have fresh dill in your garden, you could just put dried dill weed inside the tea bag, and that would work just fine. To me, there is just something about the flavor of fresh dill that doesn't come through in dried dill, so I'm really glad that I have this. So fresh dill is in the jar with our spice packet. And the next thing is to load the cucamelons into this jar. Now, I need to go ahead and go through this jar and get off the little tiny dried flower ends. It's probably not gonna hurt anything if I leave them on, but I imagine it's just not a super appetizing texture in there. So you will notice that I did not wash the dill, and I will not be washing any of these cucamelons before we ferment them. The whole point of the fermentation process is to culture the good bacteria that is already just inherently present on basically every food that we eat. The bacteria that we're really trying to culture, among many others, is a lactobacillus bacteria. So this is a lacto-fermented food and is very good for your gut. Okay, the next step is to load our brine. And you may have noticed that I did leave around an inch and a quarter of headspace above the cucamelons, and that is so I can put my fermentation weight in there and also fit the lid on top. So normally when I make a ferment, I do it in a 1/2 gallon size jar, and for that I will use a quart of brine. Well, because I'm only doing a quart of ferment, I don't need a full quart of brine, so I'm going to be doing a pint of brine. So I'm going to be placing in 1 1/2 tablespoons of salt. You want to use something non-iodized. This is sea salt. And then I'm just going to head over to my Berkey water filter and fill this up. I do not need to heat the water up. Things will dissolve just fine given a little bit of time. There. I'm going to give this a little bit of a tap on the counter just to dislodge any air bubbles. And now I'm gonna place this glass fermentation weight on top. Like I mentioned before, it's really important that everything that we're trying to ferment stays underneath the brine. The brine is what is going to protect this food and preserve it, and if it's outside of the brine, it's going to mold. Just taking my spoon here and lifting off any bits of what I think is just still a little bit of leftover blossoms from the ends of the cucamelons. I don't want any potential for mold. However, I will say a lot of people, and I've done this myself, if there is a tiny spot of superficial mold on the top of the ferment, you can skim it off, and in general, things are fine. But I feel like that's a semi-advanced fermentation skill that I wouldn't advise people do when they're just starting out. So trying to prevent mold in the first place is probably good. This here is one of my ferment pickle pipe toppers. This is going to allow any fermentation bubbles or fermentation gases that will end up developing in here to escape without allowing air and mold spores and things inside. Secure it down with a ring. And then I'm just gonna let this sit on the counter out of direct sunlight for around 3 to 7 days. I'm gonna start to see things bubbling up inside the jar, and when that happens, I'll bring you back and show you what that looks like. So it's been about 6 days since I initially started fermenting these cucamelons. It's a little bit hard to tell, but you can see when I move the jar that some little tiny champagne type bubbles come to the surface, and those bubbles are due to the fermentation process. You can kind of see here that some of them have bubbled over a little bit, and we did get a tiny bit coming out of the spout here. That's why it's really important when you ferment something to put it on top of a dish. I like to use a pie plate just in case a little bit more comes out of the top than you're expecting. So let's give these guys a taste test. I can tell you right now, I can smell the dill coming out of the spout, and it is just lovely. Please excuse my counter here. I've been making lots of sourdough bread. All right. This is what everything looks like on the inside. We've got a little bit of bubble going on, and the brine has a little bit of a cloudy consistency, all normal. So what our little fermented cucamelons look like. They are a little bit deeper green after they've gone through the fermentation process, not as bright. I don't know if you can hear that, but I bet you can. They are just as crispy. And oh, so delicious. They have that classic fermenty tang, and that dill really, really comes through, brightens the whole thing up. This is exactly what I was hoping for. Now that the fermentation process is done, I'm going to be covering the jar with a solid lid and placing this in the refrigerator. If I left this out on the counter, it would continue to ferment, which wouldn't necessarily be all bad. You can ferment basically any vegetable to your liking. If you like a little bit more of that lacto fermented tang, you could leave it out a little bit longer with your pickle pipe on, or you can put a solid lid on it, put it in the refrigerator, and basically freeze it in time at the perfect stage. Now that the solid lid is on there, I can turn this around, and a little tea bag with the tannins and all of our loose pickling ingredients is right there. It's doing good. I don't have to remove it. I'm gonna leave it in there. This little jar of fermented dill cucamelons is not gonna last very long, so I should really get out there and pick some more. This reminds me of the time that I fermented my own hot peppers and made my own homemade hot sauce. So if you're interested in seeing that video, I'm gonna link it up here. It's a little bit of an oldie but a goodie, and I'll see you next time.